6 minutes. That's how long the two pilots had. They pulled back on the controls. The plane forced its nose toward the ground. They pulled back again. It pushed down again. More than 20 times, two human beings fought a machine that was trying to fly them into the earth. And they had no idea why, because no one had ever told them the machine existed. This is the story of a passenger plane that was hiding a secret from the people flying it. A secret that came down to a single sensor, a part smaller than your hand. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what that hidden system did. Why one of the biggest companies on Earth decided not to tell anyone it was there, and how a choice made in a boardroom to save money would end 346 lives. This is not a story about a glitch. It's a story about a warning, and the people who heard it and stayed silent. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 2010. For half a century, Boeing ruled the skies with one aircraft, the 737. It first flew in 1967, a year before the moon landing, and it became the best-selling jet in history. But in 2010, their rival Airbus revealed something better, a version of their own jet that burned far less fuel. Airlines started lining up to buy it. Then came the phone call that shook Boeing to its core. American Airlines, one of their most loyal customers, was about to switch to Airbus. So Boeing faced two choices: design a brand new plane from scratch, which would take 10 years and tens of billions of dollars, or modify the half-century-old 737, fast and cheap. They chose fast and cheap. But there was a problem. The new fuel-saving engines were enormous, far larger than anything the little 1960s 737 was ever meant to carry. And the 737 sits low to the ground. The engines physically would not fit underneath the wing. So Boeing's engineers did the only thing they could. They moved the engines up and forward. And that single decision changed the way the entire plane flew. Here's what moving those engines did. Under hard thrust, the plane now had a dangerous tendency. It wanted to tilt its nose up, and if a nose tilts too far up, the plane stalls. It stops flying. It starts to fall. Boeing could have fixed this the honest way, by physically redesigning the aircraft. But that meant time and money, the very things they were trying to avoid. So instead, they fixed it with a line of code. They built a system called MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. Its job sounded simple. If it sensed the nose pitching up too far, it would automatically push the nose back down. Silently, without the pilots even noticing. On paper, it was elegant. Pilots would fly the MAX exactly like the old 737. No new training required. Boeing could sell it as just another 737. There was only one question nobody wanted to ask out loud. What happens if MCAS is wrong? To know when to act, MCAS needed to know the angle of the plane, how steeply it was pointed into the wind. It got that from a sensor on the side of the fuselage, an angle of attack sensor, a small metal vane about the size of your hand. Now here is the part that should stop you cold. MCAS, a system powerful enough to overrule the pilots and drive the plane towards the ground, listened to just one of those sensors. There were two on the aircraft. MCAS used only one. If that single sensor was wrong, damaged, frozen, or knocked out of alignment, MCAS would believe the plane was stalling when it was flying perfectly, and it would do exactly what it was designed to do: push the nose down, towards the ground, again and again and again. A single point of failure on a system that could kill everyone on board. And Boeing's own engineers had raised this exact concern. It went nowhere. But the most damning decision was still to come. Boeing knew that if pilots had to be retrained in a flight simulator to fly the MAX, it would cost their airline customers a fortune. In fact, Boeing had promised Southwest, its single biggest customer, a rebate of $1 million per plane if simulator training turned out to be required. So Boeing made sure it wouldn't be required. They convinced regulators the MAX flew just like the old 737, And to protect that story, they did something almost impossible to believe. They erased MCAS from the pilot's manual, almost entirely. The pilots flying the most advanced 737 ever built were never told that a system existed which could seize control of their aircraft and aim it at the ground. You cannot fight an enemy you don't know is there. The warning had been written. It was simply deleted. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 lifted off from Jakarta, Indonesia, carrying 189 people. Families, workers heading home, people who had no reason to believe they wouldn't land. The day before, that plane's angle of attack sensor had been replaced, and it was miscalibrated. From the moment the wheels left the runway, it was feeding MCAS a lie. The system believed the plane was stalling. It wasn't. So MCAS did its job. It pushed the nose down. The pilots pulled it back. MCAS pushed down again. They pulled back. It pushed down. Over 20 times in the span of 11 minutes, 2 pilots flipping through a manual that said nothing, fighting an enemy with no name. 11 minutes after takeoff, Lion Air 610 struck the Java Sea at over 500 miles an hour. There were no survivors. And here is what turns this tragedy into something darker. After the crash, Boeing knew what had happened. They knew it was MCAS, and they let the planes keep flying. 5 months later, March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa. Same model, same system, same false signal. But this time, the pilots had heard about Lion Air. They knew MCAS existed now. They followed the emergency steps Boeing had finally released. They cut the power to the system. And still, they could not save it. The plane was already diving so steeply that the forces on the tail were too violent to overcome by human hands. 6 minutes after takeoff, Flight 302 drove into the ground at nearly the speed of sound. 157 people were gone. 2 crashes, 5 months apart. The same cause. 346 people in total. Only now, only after the second one, did the world finally ground every 737 MAX on the planet. What the investigations uncovered was worse than a flaw in the design. Internal Boeing messages came to light. In them, employees mocked the very plane they were building. One wrote that the MAX had been designed by clowns, who are in turn supervised by monkeys. Another admitted they had misled the regulators. And the regulator, the FAA, the agency meant to protect the public, had handed much of the plane's safety certification back to Boeing itself. Boeing was, in effect, grading its own homework. Engineers had warned about the single sensor. A manager had warned about chaos on the factory floor. The concerns were written down, raised, and pushed aside because every delay cost money, and the schedule always won. The warnings were never missing. Someone simply decided they weren't worth listening to. 6 minutes. That's how long those pilots had. They did everything they were trained to do. They pulled back on the controls with every ounce of strength they had. The problem was never their skill. The problem was a decision made years earlier, in a room they would never see, by people who would never board that flight. They were warned. They flew anyway. This was foreseen.